Good evening, Washington, D.C. I'm Carol Cook, and welcome to the special edition of The View, The Decade in Review, brought to you by Happy Hair Hairspray. Two powers from opposite sides of the world emerged in the 1950s. Dwight D. Eisenhower of the United States, after an easy win in his re-election, and Nikita Khrushchev for the Soviet Union, became the new master or premier in 1953, after the death of Joseph Stalin.
When it came to the space race, the United States and Soviets were always fighting for the lead. Khrushchev appealed to many new nations of communists coming out of colonialism by giving them economic help and showing them technological achievements of the Soviet Union. He told his followers that because the Soviet space satellite Sputnik was launched successfully, that it proved communism would bury the capitalist system. Eisenhower became alarmed by the Soviets' success of launching Sputnik because it foreshadowed that America had out-of-date aircraft defenses, and with that, the strategy of massive attacks on the Soviet Union. In 1959, Secretary of State Dulles resigned, leaving Eisenhower responsible for carrying out international relations. However, he took the approach of keeping himself within limits and didn't think about making new commitments. Vice President Richard M. Nixon visited the Soviet Union in 1959, and Khrushchev came to the United States soon after. Eisenhower and Khrushchev decided to assemble a summit conference. Just a few days before the meeting, an American plane was shot down over the Soviet Union, and the pilot was captured and confessed to being a spy. Once President Eisenhower took the blame for the mission, Khrushchev pointed the finger at the U.S. as having weak aggression, and the summit conference never ended up happening.
One of the biggest domestic issues in the United States in the 1950s was issues in the South. For the highlights of these issues throughout the decade, we're going to Stacy Schuring in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Reporting from Little Rock, this is Stacy Schuring. In the past decade, civil rights was a grave issue with much debate. In the 1950s, attitudes towards the rights of minorities changed. The prejudice was damaging the nation's image. In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren ordered states to proceed with desegregation after the Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka case. People were claiming that segregation was not separated but equal, but inherently unequal. The South opposed integration strongly. Citizen civil councils emerged as Eisenhower did little to discourage the groups. In 1957, Eisenhower was forced to use the National Guard in Little Rock to enforce desegregation at Central High School. As a result, 9 black students began to attend the school. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 created a Civil Rights Commission and a Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice. Also, it gave the Attorney General power to stop election officials from prohibiting blacks to vote. That is a very serious issue that still lingers on today. Now back to Washington, D.C. after this message. Stay tuned for more of The View presented by Happy Hair.
If your hair is looking flat and you need a fix-up stat, Happy Hair can change that.
If your hair is no fun, don't put it in a bun. Happy Hair gets the job done. When your hair is looking small or appearing rather dull, Happy Hair can fix it all.
Happy Hair, a new lift for tired hair.
Welcome back to The View, presented by Happy Hair Hairspray. After World War II, the United States became very involved in world relations. Just before the 1950s, the Jewish people got rights to their own state, Israel. However, the road to this state was not easy, and the Jews needed a lot of help from both the United States and the United Nations to keep peace between the Jewish and the Arabs.
After the Holocaust, many Jewish people felt that they needed their own state. Many immigrated to the British-governed Palestine in the late 1940s and wanted to declare this land the State of Israel. However, this aggravated many Arabs that occupied the area, and fighting broke out. The president felt sympathy towards the Jewish and supported the need for Israel. The UN established a special committee on Palestine in April 1947 that got both the Jewish and Arabs to agree to UN Resolution 181, which created a Jewish state, a Palestine state, and an international region around the Jewish. By 1948, Israel was established, and soon after, Arab armies attacked the new state. Even though the Arabs had far more numbers, the Israelis were better managed and won easily. The Jewish had finally succeeded.
Although the Israelites got their land, there was still fighting in the Middle East, and it spread into Egypt when Britain, Israel, and France invaded in 1956. The invasion only lasted a few days until the United States and Soviet Union both stepped in to stop the fighting.
In 1952, Egypt went through a state of change when King Farouk was overthrown and Gamal Abdel Nasser became the new leader. The United States agreed to loan money to Egypt to build the Aswan Dam on the Nile River, but wouldn't sell them weapons. Consequently, Nasser leaned communist and Eisenhower didn't finance the dam. Because of this, Britain and France became involved. In 1954, Nasser forced the British to abandon their base at Suez, but the British attempted to take the canal back in 1956. Also, Israel attacked Egypt because of the continuous Arab attacks. This outraged both the Soviet Union and the U.S. and demanded ceasefire. After British and France refused, Khrushchev threatened to use atomic missiles, and Eisenhower commanded pulling out. Israel, Britain, and France withdrew after only 9 days of fighting. This earned the U.S. a lot of admiration in the Arab land, especially after the issues with Palestine and Israel.
The United States not only handled foreign relations in Europe and Asia, but they also dealt with a lot of issues in Latin America.
The situation in Latin America began a downward spiral following the close of World War II. During the war, the United States had peaceful relations with Latin America as raw materials and arms were traded. This relationship was solidified through the Mutual Defense Pact signed at Rio de Janeiro in September of 1947. The following year, the Organization of American States, or OAS, was created. In this alliance, all decisions made required 2/3 of a vote from participants. The U.S. had no veto power or any other special powers in this organization. Relations did not stay so benign, however, as the Cold War progressed. Radical Latin Americans began to accuse the U.S. of supporting groups of wealthy tyrants, while the conservatives claimed that the U.S.'s insufficient economy aid had led to the growing poverty. To further tensions, Jacobo Arbenz led his Guatemalan nation into importing Soviet weapons. In response, the United States armed troops from Honduras with weapons, and the Honduran army marched on Guatemala and overthrew Arbenz. The Latin American opinion of America was quickly turning malignant. Americans did not realize the extent of this hatred until Vice President Nixon's proclaimed goodwill tour of South America in 1954. Latin Americans met Nixon with open hostility, and he was forced to abandon the tour. Upon his return to the U.S., Nixon was treated as a hero. In Cuba, Fidel Castro led a revolutionary movement against current dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro began by forming resistance groups in towns and small cities, and then he organized a parallel government. Batista was eventually overthrown and Castro came into power. In his speeches, Castro began to openly criticize the U.S. When Cuba formed a close trading relationship with the Soviet Union, mainly involving sugar, the U.S. prohibited the importation of Cuban sugar into America. President Eisenhower soon broke off all relations with Cuba when Khrushchev announced that he would defend Cuba if the United States intervened in that nation.
As the 1950s come to a close, the United States is still a strong superpower fighting to end communism and bring peace. That's all for today, folks. Thanks for watching the special edition of The View, the Decade in Review, presented by Happy Hair Hairspray.